The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Our guest today is Bob Keeshan, TV's Captain Kangaroo. He's the author of Family Fun, an activity book published by Deaconess Press in the fall of 1994. Mr. Keeshan will be talking with Misti Snow, editor of Mindworks, a regular feature of the Star Tribune. They'll be discussing ways that society needs to work together to make things better for children and their families.
I had the distinct pleasure of being here today with an American icon, Mr. Bob Keeshan, better known as Captain Kangaroo. For many baby boomers, myself included, and for children who came later, Captain Kangaroo was our television friend. We watched hours of the gentle, friendly captain with the large pockets, who had an interesting assortment of friends, ranging from Mr. Green Jeans to Bunny Rabbit to Mr. Moose and Grandfather Clock. Captain Kangaroo began airing in 1955 and ran on network TV through 1984. It was then picked up by public television for a few years. It was the longest-running children's television program in TV history. In recent years, Mr. Keeshan has turned his efforts to work as an advocate for children. He also recently wrote a book called Family Fun Activities Book, which is brimful of ideas for how families can play together. Mr. Keeshan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Misty.
I imagine you are very tired of people beginning conversations with you with "I remember," but I'm going to start the same way. I remember Captain Kangaroo, but not in the same way I find that some of my friends and family remember. When they think about Captain Kangaroo, they remember very specific things. When I remember the program, what I remember is the overall tone. And what I'm struck by is the kind of pervasive gentleness that I associate with that program. And I'm wondering if I'm misremembering that. Was it really that gentle, and it was that gentle by design?
It was both by design. It certainly was gentle. And I don't think you're alone in recalling the program that way. I think many of yesterday's children, now in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, whom I meet doing at a speaking engagement or whatever, will now, because they are a good deal more articulate than they were when they were young and experiencing the program, will say things to me that are very nice and are confirmation that that what we have always attempted to do, we indeed did accomplish with them. They will say general things like, "You were always my good friend. You got me started in the right sort of way in the morning in that hectic period before I went off to school or before I had to catch a school bus, and you made me feel good about myself." Those were precisely the things that we have always, and to this day, attempt to do with the captain. So yes, certainly a lot of people will remember specific things like Bunny Rabbit and Mr. Moose and Grandfather Clock and Magic Drawing Board and Banana Man and all that sort of thing. But the general impressions are the ones that interest me most. And so you really are not alone, Misty. I appreciate it. Thank you.
When I look back at that, I realize, and I think people are shocked to realize, you were probably only in your late 20s when you
Well, you were
started
talking
that?
about my father, I think.
Oh,
No. I was indeed. Although I was by the time the captain started, really a veteran in television, because I was 28 years of age when the captain started, but I had started in television 8 years before that, when I was just 20. I had returned from service right after World War II. I had been in the Marine Corps, and I went back to my job that I held when I was in my last year in high school, which was as a page at NBC. And they had to give me my job back because I was returning from service. They would have preferred college graduates at that point, but they had to re-employ me. But I was going to college at night, and I was fully intending to become a lawyer. And I think I saved the nation a great deal of travail by not passing the bar. But Bob Smith, who was in radio at that time, was charged with putting together a program which became Howdy Doody. There were very few television sets in the entire nation at that time, 80,000 from coast to coast. Our NBC network was New York, Philadelphia, and Syracuse. And so Bob would ask the professionals, the radio actors, to help him. And they just sort of laughed. They said, well, you know, television is something that is in the distant future, 30 years from now. Maybe by 1980 or something, there'll be television. But now we're not going to work in that. We're going to work in the senior medium radio. So in desperation, he asked this page boy to help him. And I didn't think of it as a career, not at all. I thought of it as a stipend to augment my income. I was receiving $12 a week from the GI Bill of Rights and 30 some odd dollars from the National Broadcasting Company, and he was tipping me $5 extra for every show. So it was a windfall. But of course, by 5 years later, I created the character Clarabelle, and 5 years later, television had just exploded beneath us. There were now 30 million sets in the country, and we were seen coast to coast, all the way to California. So I was a veteran, a pioneer. I left Howdy Doody. I did 2 local programs in New York. One of them, a Geppetto-like toy maker, a grandfather character. And it was this program that drew the attention of CBS. I don't think because it was a gentle show, which it was, because I had changed personally in this period, from being a 20-year-old very far from young children in my understanding of them. I had in that interim period married and began looking, and had a son, and began looking at television from an entirely different perspective, that of the parent. And I thought that this was a medium that had great potential to help in the nurturing system. So the role that I played on that local program was very quiet and very gentle, and took advantage of the potential for intimacy, if you will, in talking to an individual child. I don't think that's what attracted CBS. What attracted CBS was the large audience that it had garnered. And so they asked me to put together a program for them. And at 28 years of age, in 1955, I became another elderly man, Captain Kangaroo. I no longer require the makeup I required then. I have grown into the part.
I'm very curious. When I think about how people are developing programs for kids today, I picture them sitting around a table and talking high concept, low concept, mission statements, maybe objectives, and probably the primary question, how are we going to market this to make a lot of bucks? How are we going to do all the products?
That, Misty, is absolutely, it's a very keen observation of children's television today. When I'm asked what is the difference really in producing a children's television program today and years ago, I said years ago television stations were held accountable for what they did for special audiences, children included, and at license renewal time they had better be able to answer very difficult questions that were put to them by the Federal Communications Commission. We deregulated broadcasting in the early 80s and set them free of all those obligations. So today, only in public television do we uniformly ask the question, is this program going to be good for children? Is it going to help to nurture them? Generally in commercial...
Why isn't that asked?
Well, because in commercial television, they don't have to be held accountable. And so the question the producers ask themselves, is this going to make me a lot of money? Am I going to be able to reach into the pockets of children and their parents and grandparents? So that's why we see programs like the Morphin Rangers and exploitive programs that are designed, very often with violence, to attract a large audience. And violence is attractive to human beings. Why should we be surprised that children are attracted by violence when their parents are absorbing violence through television and motion pictures all the time and liking it? So, unfortunately, under those circumstances, we are not doing the kinds of programs that children really need. But it's not just broadcaster responsibility, it's also parental responsibility.
But that's what confuses me. These people who are sitting in those rooms deciding these programs, part of what informed Captain Kangaroo was you were a parent. You've said that. Some of these people are parents, or I would guess they're parents. Why aren't they coming into that with a parental perspective and saying it is going to matter what I produce for
Well,
children?
because they know that they don't really stand a chance in most commercial venues unless they are commercially successful. And I've met a lot of producers who think of themselves as thinking parents and decent parents, but this is different. This is my business. And so I've got to produce the kind of programming that's going to grab a large audience. It's a mass medium television, being less so now with cable and other technologies. But that is the general thinking, to go for as much as you possibly can and make as much money. And there is an enormous amount of money to be made by exploiting children.
I want to talk about a specific show I'm sure you've been asked about. In fact, I know you've been asked about, and you commented critically on it, and that's Barney. You said, I think that it's a little dull, I think is the word you used for it. But what I find interesting about Barney, it seems so emblematic of what's going on. Here is a show that, much like you, it infuses children with love. They are just so responsive to this character and so passionate about it. And on the other hand, it inspires this passionate, almost hatred and viciousness out of adults. And I find that so puzzling, that we are so somehow offended by the innocence that the youngest are responding to. What caused that
I don't think that's the reason for the reaction of many adults. I think my only criticism of Barney, and I think it is a positive show, it certainly is benign and does help in the nurturing of children. My criticism is, as a television producer, I think it's not extensive enough. It's not creative enough. There are not enough characters. There are not enough situations. That there's a redundancy, which is important with children, but too much, I think, is not very creative. I don't think that Barney has a long life with any individual child. Child will stay for a shorter period of time and then move on to something else. And it is that lack of creativity which I think bothers most adults watching the program. Now, if I were a producer of Barney, I would say, I'm doing very well with this program. I'm making an enormous amount of money with merchandising. Let's take some of that money, put it back into the program, create new characters, new situations, give it more variety and more breadth, and I think the show would then have greater longevity, and it would be a benefit to the producers to do so.
But what I find really interesting, and I think we go back to how gentle and innocent Captain Kangaroo was, there seems to be innocence comes second to other things. You make a lot of money, or you let children watch very violent programming, whether it's video games or movies or TV, and innocence keeps dropping down. And I'm very curious about why it seems that we don't want to somehow foster more innocence rather than get rid of it.
I don't think parents think about that. I don't think they think about that at all. I think the failure of parents and their use of television is not a thought-out process at all. They're not saying, well, let the child watch a program that's violent. No, they're saying, I'm busy, I work hard, my life is different than my mother's was, and my father's was. You know, so many mothers work outside the home. We have so many single-parent families. 49% of our children, young children, live in single-parent households. So the structure of the family is radically different. There is no simple answer to the problems that the family faces, including the appropriate use of television. And so many parents will come home faced with a chattering 4-year-old, which 4-year-olds are designed to do. And the parent will be so busy and tired, and I'm sympathetic to that. It's understandable, but not excusable. The parent will then say, honey, I'm so tired, do me a favor, go watch television. And so they use television in an inappropriate way as a babysitter, and it is not even children's television that these children are watching. It is almost over 90% of television viewing by children in this nation is of adult television. Soap operas, game shows, Oprah, Donahue, Geraldo. Putting aside whether we as adults like those shows, they certainly are not designed for children. And the subject matter in many of those programs is entirely inappropriate. And parents don't even think about this. Because if they did, you know, if I said to a parent, why don't you give your child dinner now, put 3 candy bars on the table and some soda pop. he or she would say, "Are you crazy? I would never treat my child that way. They need proper nutrition to build strong and healthy bodies." But our children need proper nutrition to build their minds and their hearts and their emotions, to help them develop in other ways. And we think nothing of ignoring that diet and feeding them absolute trash.
And it goes beyond that. I understand the tired parent, the weary parent
Yes.
at the end of the day. What I don't understand, I read a lot of kids writing, and they write about the very violent R-rated movies they're being taken to when they're 7 or 8 or 9, and then they're suffering terrible nightmares they're not telling anybody about. And frequently they're watching those shows side by side with mom or dad. A colleague said he went to Pulp Fiction recently,
Oh, yes.
and saw the parents there with, of course, their 7 or 8-year-old child who kept running up and down the aisle, either out of boredom or sheer terror. I don't understand the mentality that says when you're sitting there watching it, that parents don't recognize that as poison and change.
Well, and they may recognize it and they may feel badly about it, but the alternative is to get a babysitter and go to the movie. And a lot of parents say, "I don't want to go to that trouble or expense. I'll just take the kids with me," and not really care what they're watching, what they're being exposed to, the value system that they're developing from exposure to this. You know, when we see all the violence that we see in real life today, it's not just children, but we as adults have such vicarious experience with violence that we have become immunized. I can remember, I'm 67 years old, I can remember as a child of 7 or 8 that there was a murder committed in my suburban community. And I remember to this day the mental process I went through trying to come to grips with that. I could not conceive of how someone could take a human life. It was something I could never accept. I didn't know. You won't find any trouble finding an 8-year-old with that problem today, struggling with that notion today. So we have become immunized to violence, and we don't think much of it. But of course, then when we see it, when we see 5-year-olds tossed out of windows in Chicago, and we see even in Europe, we see young children murdered by other young children, we say, "Isn't that terrible? There's something wrong with the generation today." And it's not. It's us that should be taking the responsibility and the blame, because we have given them these values.
Right. You gave a speech here in 1986 that I want to tell you a couple of things you said in that. You gave the speech shortly after the Reagans announced their Just Say No to Drugs campaign, and
Yes.
you were justifiably critical of that approach of simply just say no. But these are a couple of things you said in 86. The president says we cannot forget who we are, but we have already forgotten who we are. We've raised a generation that is to a certain extent morally illiterate. If we fail to nurture the young generation, we may find ourselves someday with a society not worth defending against enemies without. There are two things I'd like you to talk about regarding those excerpts. One is that your notion that there is a morally illiterate generation or two out there, and I'd like you to talk about moral illiteracy. The other is, you made that speech in 86, 8 years ago, and probably by almost every measure the kids are in worse straits than 8 years ago. All kinds of crises in their lives are getting worse. And I'm really curious where you find hope after you've seen all of this going on for so many years.
Well, if you are by nature a caring human being, you have to find hope. It is somewhat analogous to Dr. Spock's comments recently. In his 80s, he pointed out with his new book how sad he was to be toward the end of his life. He's not there yet, but toward the end of his life, leaving children in worse condition than he found them as a young physician. And that is very sad. I see the same thing. Children in much worse condition than when we found them. But you know, we are in many ways a society that doesn't have values to pass on to our children. We are morally illiterate in many ways. But you know something else that's at fault in our society? Our search for easy answers. We don't want to put in any of the hard work it takes to raise a single child or to raise a generation. That's hard work, and it involves not only parents, but it involves every member of our society. We have to work hard at raising children individually or as a generation, and we don't do that.
But where did it get lost? I always have people
Well,
ask,
they
how
got
did it
lost
happen?
because the family structure broke down tremendously. It's hardly the same as it was 30 years ago. Divorce carried a stigma 30 years ago. Today, it's commonplace. So we have half our kids living in single-parent households, not only because of divorce, but teen pregnancy. You know, we used to, there was a shame to pregnancy out of wedlock that doesn't exist today. And you know, certainly we have to be understanding of individuals faced with that situation. But at the same time, why are teens delivering almost 1 million children a year out of wedlock? Why? We have to ask ourselves why that's happening. It doesn't just happen because, well, you know, she has no morals, she's a loose child. No, it's not that at all. She's entered into a relationship which is probably the kindest, nicest relationship she's had in her young life. She's been kicked around since the time she was an infant, a toddler, or whatever, and not only physically but emotionally, maybe sexually abused. And here, as a 14 or 15-year-old, she meets her Romeo, somebody who gives her affection and kindness and love. And before we know it, it has resulted in a pregnancy. We have to understand the roots of that and why. Now, if we don't care about children, we have to understand it, because as taxpayers, it's destroying us. Every early term child, which most teen pregnancies result in, costing us $100,000 a year, not the teenager, but all of us in society. Much more if developmental problems are involved. And so we have to say to ourselves, well, we're dumb. If we worked with young people and prevented teen pregnancy, then we wouldn't be spending this enormous amount of money. We just don't think about, we don't draw lines between the ills that we have in society, substance abuse and teen pregnancy, illiteracy, violence in the streets and in the home, and crime. We don't draw the line between those and taking care of children early on in life. Politicians are the worst in this. You know, I can't tell you the number of politicians I've talked to who say, oh, I love children. Children are just absolutely wonderful. And here at election time, I kiss more babies than you could imagine. Well, sure, that's talk. But when it comes to budget time, the politicians are sitting around the table and they're saying, boy, this is tough. This is a tight budget. Sure it is. It is a tight budget. And they say, well, how about this cut here? Oh, no, that's the highway workers lobby. Those guys contributed to my campaign coffer, and you know, they can organize and they can vote against us, and the employees municipal union, oh, we can't go against them because they'll rally against us. Hey, what about this maternal and child health? Oh, hey, we can cut that. Look at that, that's a lot of money. Let's do that 50%, cut that back. Why worry about it? Because kids are not organized. They don't vote, and nobody really represents them.
And yet kids weren't organized years ago and we didn't treat them this badly.
No, that's true too.
I think about the fact that the baby boomers grew up on the likes of you, very gentle and all of that. The baby boomers are now the people who are the parents of some of these kids in crisis.
Yeah, but our politics are different today too.
Is that what happened?
Yeah, I think two things happen. Politics are very different than they were, and politicians react to who can hurt them. They're not afraid of kids. Any politician in the candor will say, kids don't bite, don't worry about it. We don't have to worry about that. But the highway lobby, they are strong and they can hurt us. And then also I think at the time, say of the child labor laws at the turn of the century, I think our families were stronger. We had an immigrant tradition which called for strong families and called for values. Those values really don't exist to the extent that they did at the turn of the century. We've changed a lot in 100 years, and children suffer by that. 14 million kids living in poverty. Don't tell me America loves children, because they don't. The facts are there, they don't, in public policy or private actions.
I was talking to some advocates recently, and they said one of the big problems is we're still admiring the problem, that we're all waxing very eloquently about the problem. We hear about the problem, we can name it in every way, and we can't get beyond naming the problem into solving the problems. And I think people are ready to try to start solving the problems, but the question is, what are people to do collectively, and what are they to do individually to solve it?
It's very difficult to act when you feel strongly. I'm the national spokesperson for an organization called the Coalition for America's Children, which represents virtually every organization that has an agenda on behalf of children, and some that don't, like the American Association of Retired Persons, who are wise enough to know that children represent the future, and they don't want their elderly to be endangered 10 years from now because our economy is in a shambles, because we haven't treated our children today properly. So what we always say is that we have to organize on behalf of children, and we try it, and we question politicians and office holders and so on, but it's a futile effort, really, very futile. We really can't bring the lobbying effect and the power that so many other special interests have. And this nation today, on the national, on the state, and on the local level, is really, it really responds to special interests. We fight each other over the budget, and we don't really care who's left behind in that battle.
I heard Jonathan Kozol say a few years back, and he's been so involved in children education issues, and he was being maybe a little bit overstating this fact, but he said things won't change for children until we have crowds in the streets the way we did for the Vietnam War. Until we get that level of passion amongst the population, we're not going to change a thing.
At the Coalition, we've done a lot of surveying, very professional surveys, and the taxpayers who I think should be responsible, do put the welfare of children ahead of virtually everything else. They think that the way we treat children is a greater possible holds greater potential for demise for this nation than other things like health care, except for children's health care. They want children to be cared for. I often think that maybe the Clintons and the administration made a mistake in going for the whole ball of wax at once. Maybe if they had broken it up and said, let's take care of the health of children, because there are over 30 million children who aren't properly cared for, properly insured, and the like. Maybe we could have put that through. It's hard to fight in a public forum. It's hard to fight the well-being of children. So it's going to take enormous efforts on the part of everyone who cares. The taxpayers want it. The taxpayers are willing. They don't want to spend a lot of money because they feel that it's not being well spent. They want reform. They think that the public assistance program in most states is bankrupt, and they may be right in many instances. They think that there's a lot of cheating in welfare and all that sort of thing. I think that's a little more overstated than it should be, but it should be looked at, surely. But we have to say to ourselves, we have to invest in our children, because the children are the future. And if we don't invest in our children, we're all going to pay for it. You can be the finest parent on the face of all the 50 states we have now, in the 50 states, and your child, well treated and well cared for and loved, is going to grow up with these other children, and they're going to share that world, and they're going to pay a very high price in that world.
So you obviously love children very, very much, and wish people would share it. When you look at children, what do you see when you look at them?
I see hope. I'm just delighted. I love to talk to a child, and I'm talking about young children, 3 and 4 and 5 years of age. I see wonderful things. Usually, not all children have hope. Obviously, many of them are despondent. I don't usually get to meet too many of them unless I'm in a special situation. I visit a psychiatric hospital, and I meet a lot of children who are now quite ill and need great attention. But I see hope for children, and I see the enthusiasm of children for the future. I refer to the first 6 years of life as a voyage of discovery, because it's a wonderful world opening up all around us. Everything is new. We take it all for granted, the leaves and the trees and the grass and the rain and everything around us. Well, we've seen it all before, but a child opens up her eyes on a day and sees a leaf and takes notice of it. And that's a wonderful, it's an awesome thing, really. And if we could understand that as adults, as parents and as teachers, and allow children to make those discoveries and to feel confident in their future, that future will be great, because we will build their self-confidence, their self-esteem.
I'm terribly sorry we're out of time, but the children of the past and certainly the children of the future are very lucky to have you in their corner. Thank you very much.
You're very kind.
wonderful to have TV's Captain Kangaroo, Bob Keeshan, continuing to advocate for children. Thank you, Bob Keeshan, Misti Snow, and thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.